Is the mic working?
Tú me avisas.
I know, I can hear me, I can show.
Sí. Ay, ¿esto qué hace aquí? Muy buenos días, tengan todas y todos ustedes. Para mí es un placer, como coordinadora del Seminario Universitario de Historia, Filosofía y Estudios de las Ciencias y la Medicina, presentar en esta ocasión al doctor Kapil Raj. El doctor Kapil Raj es profesor de Historia de la Ciencia en la Escuela de Altos Estudios en Ciencias Sociales en París. Procedente de una formación académica científica, las matemáticas, Raj comenzó a explorar los campos de la epistemología y la historia de la ciencia para debatir la cuestión de la transmisión de las ideas científicas entre diferentes culturas. Ha publicado extensamente sobre la historia natural, la estadística social y la geografía en el contexto del encuentro europeo con el sur de Asia desde el siglo XVI hasta el presente. En sus escritos, Raj destaca el papel de las circulaciones e interacciones culturales en la formación y transformación del conocimiento científico. Las investigaciones de Raj contribuyen a los debates sobre el eurocentrismo en la historia del colonialismo y el postcolonialismo. En su reciente libro, Relocating Modern Science, Circulation and the Making of Knowledge in South Asia and Europe, propone estudiar la circulación como concepto central en el análisis histórico de la construcción de ideas naturalistas, geográficas, lingüísticas y sociales. Esta perspectiva global le permite demostrar el carácter policéntrico de la emergencia del conocimiento y fomentar el estudio de las historias relacionales. En esta conferencia, el profesor presentará una ponencia titulada Decolonizing Modern Science. Les quiero comentar que esta es la tercera vez que el profesor Raj nos visita aquí en la Facultad de Ciencias en México y para nosotros es un gran placer tenerlo. You are very welcome to Mexico as usual and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Por esta introducción, ajá, sí.
Okay. Now I'm yeah. Okay. Today, what only give you all is called Decolonizing Modern Science. This is the question. This is a question. And it's my reflection, more than anything else. And I'd like to, because it's a reflection, I'd like to finish the question itself. Yeah, that's why I'm asking. Is the mic on? It's okay? Is it better now? Yeah? Can you hear me now? I mean, can they hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Right. So, and because it's a question, I'd like to throw it open to you all. To finish with an open question so that we can take on this discussion. So, what is this? What is decolonizing modern science and where does it come from? So let me start my talk by flagging what I consider to be the key terms of this talk. So the first one, in fact, is this idea of science itself. And modern science, which is what we've been talking about all along, which is what, when we talk about the history of science, we talk about the history of modern science. Now, this modern science itself can be, I mean, science itself is broken up into two parts. One is what we call science, and the other one is something that came up as colonial science. So the two terms, modern science and colonial science, live side by side. And I'll go into this history a little bit. So these are the terms that I'm going to use all through this talk. Now, this is the way in which science itself has been configured in the study of science in academia. Now, more recently, two further terms have been introduced. One is post-colonial and post-colonialism, which is a chronological marker and a movement at the same time. So I'm going to talk about the effects on the history of science, first of this caesura between science, on the one hand, modern science, and then colonial science, and then the effects on our history of this one movement, which is the post-colonial movement and post-colonialism. In other words, the post-colonial as a marker, as a historical marker at some point. So if there's colonial science, then we are living right now in a post-colonial age. And there's a post-colonialism, which is a kind of a belief, a movement attached to this. And the second is the decolonial, much more recent. It has to do with, it's another colonial marker, and it implies another, this time not a movement, but a manifesto, decoloniality. So I'm going to explain a little bit where these terms come from and what they're about. So very quickly, modern science itself and its history, so which I've already talked so much about last year, and also we keep coming back to this, which is the start of the history of science at the beginning of the 20th century. So with people like Sarton, Hessen, Boris Hessen, and this whole idea of a caesura, which starts modern science, the idea that there's a capitalist revolution, and it is that capitalist revolution which gives rise to modern science. Before that, of course, I mean, you know, in the time of Sarton, there was no such break. It was positivist. In other words, it was cumulative. Of course, Sarton recognizes that at one point, the center of gravity of science shifts to Europe, and we can call that modern science. But it's not a break, which is the case in Hessen. And then, of course, you come to the scientific revolution of Koire, its formalization in Butterfield and Rupert Hall. Finally, Thomas Kuhn and the idea of scientific revolutions. But all this has to do with modern science, which is not situated anywhere. It has to do with the phenomenon of science. But by the 1950s and 1960s, at the same time as this history of science is being developed, another question comes up, which is the question of the origins of modern science. Because all through all that I've told you about in this, modern science is situated in the West. No one talks about it as such. It's universal. It's situated in the West, on the other hand. So in the 1950s and 60s, the question comes up, but what about the rest of the world? So of course, one answer to that is Joseph Needham's idea, which is that, in fact, modern science is not restricted. It's not a monopoly of the West. In fact, it grew through a contribution of all societies and all cultures and all civilizations in the world. So modern science is like an ocean, and all these individual currents are like rivers flowing into the sea. And so it is today our mission, in fact, for Needham, to redistribute science and to give it back to different people. So modern science belongs to everyone. He's ecumenical about it. So that's one conception. So you see how in the 1950s, while the science is developing as a universal idea, at the same time anchored in Europe, there are questions about what its relationship to the rest of the world is. And one answer is Joseph Needham's. Another answer comes from diffusionism as it's elaborated by Basala. And in this idea, it is, I mean, science is Western. That's what he says. It's the spread of Western science. And it's not as if everyone has contributed to it. No one has contributed to it. It is a Western origin. It is a Western product. And then its history, what we have to look at is how it spreads to the rest of the world. And what he proposes is the notion of diffusion. So things then are developed in Europe and they are spread to the rest of the world. Now, this is the notion of science as it is in the mainstream history of science. And you can keep reading even till today. In fact, if you pick up ISIS, or if you pick up history of science, if you pick up Nuncius, if you pick up the British Journal for the History of Science, basically, the core of the contributions has to do with a science which is, on the one hand, it's universal, and on the other hand, it is Western. I mean, it has to do with what is produced in the West. In other words, in Europe, and or at least in Northwestern Europe and in the US, North America. So it's a kind of a geography which is not clearly announced as such, but it's a geography which is there. Now, it was against this notion that in the 1970s, especially against Basala's idea of diffusion, that a movement grew which was called Science and Empire. This movement grew in the 1970s and 80s in the non-West, basically in Asia and partly in North Africa. The idea being that science, in fact, this history of science is ideological. It ignores the fact that there is a history of science elsewhere. And that history of science, in fact, empire, the whole of modernity, which is coeval, which happens at the same time as the development of modern science, takes place at the expense of other forms of knowledge. Now, these other forms of knowledge are what? These are forms of knowledge or forms of science which are associated with China, with India, with the Arab world, in other words, Islamic science, above all. So it is a way of reinstating sciences or forms of knowledge which had been developed in other empires, also the Ottoman Empire, which everyone thinks is ignored in this history of modern science. So, in fact, there's a conceit in the history of science, in the way in mainstream history of science, and its Eurocentricity, and Basala's diffusionist model, which is like a red rag. It's like as if you're waving a rag at a bull, and the bull reacts, and the bull comes from these old civilizations of the Eurasian continent, along with North Africa. So that is where this is situated. So it's this, because in Basala's model, the non-European world is a tabula rasa. There's nothing that's happening there, And so this is a reaction against this, very strong reaction. And it has to do also with science policy. It has to do with, so these people actually show that, this model does not work. And these historians and sociologists, they constitute themselves as a group which is called Science and Empire. And through a series of publications like Science and Empire, essays in Indian context, but also a French group around Patrick Petitjean, Catherine Jamy, and Anne-Marie Moulin, they organized a large conference in Paris in 1991 around this theme, because while it started in India, and the Indians had organized a large conference too, where they invited British scholars, where they invited South Asian scholars, a few Chinese scholars, and also the French scholars. The French, on the other hand, took it upon themselves to, in a way, appropriate this idea and make it theirs. So Science and Empire became theirs, and they had more money because they had UNESCO money. They were able to invite people from South America as well, especially from Brazil, Argentina, and also Mexico. And the book that came out of that was Science and Empires. It wasn't Science and Empire, it was Science and Empires. So the idea over here is that there is a science, but there are many imperial histories. Now, the two coalesced at one point, and they were able to get recognition from UNESCO's International Union of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, so that now Science and Empire became a brand name. It's like Coca-Cola. And it took over the problematization of the science outside of the West. In a way, it was an umbrella for that. And of course, to their credit, this grouping is one of the first to seriously look at the historical phenomenon of science on a global, or at least on a transnational scale, taking into account the power asymmetries at work, but also according agency to non-Western actors. So there is an asymmetry. The reason why modern science is associated with the West is because of empire and because of their power. But it's a way, in fact, a call that there are other people as well, a reminder that there are non-Western actors. So, but of course, I mean, the problem is that all these scholars, or most of them, they shied away, they refused, if they didn't actually totally ignore the fact that there was also something else that was happening in the West, in Western science, which is that while Western science didn't, I mean, Western historians of science did not question the very notion of what science was about and how it was anchored in the West, they did at least do one thing, which was they moved science away from universal to the local, to the laboratory. And they started asking other questions as to how science becomes universal. Not that it is universal because it's Western, because it's superior, but how does it become universal? What are the mechanisms involved in this? So the universal becomes a problem. It becomes problematic, and you have to give an answer to that. That is the work of people like Steve Shapin, like, you know, Simon Schaffer, Harry Collins, to name but a few. So what they're talking about is what is required for something to move out of the laboratory into the rest of the world. Because it's not, you cannot take for granted the fact that science is universal the way it was done in the past, in the positivist history, or even in Marxist histories. It's universal because it's capitalist, and because capitalism is universal, so science is universal. You know, you can't take any of these into account. You have to look and see what are the strategies involved in people's work. How are they making science universal? Now, this is something that none of these people actually considers, because their idea is that Western science, I mean, science is universal, but it's not only the West that made it universal. We too, we are there. You know, it's a reminder that there are other people involved in this. And so then the thing is that in this post-colonial world, they're trying to make their place. The problem with this also is that the moment you begin to do that, you're faced with, you open the door for religious and political extremists at the same time. Because then science is not just Indian science, it becomes Hindu science, for instance. It's attached to Hinduism. It's attached to Islam. It's attached to Chinese Taoism and Buddhism. So then what you do is, what you have is, against Western civilization, which is then characterized as Judeo-Christian, you have a rise and an uncontrolled rise of religious histories, which are then attaching science to different religions. So it starts with with a kind of a national civilizational problem, which is, we had science too. There's an Indian civilization, there's a Chinese civilization, there's an Islamic civilization. And this degenerates very fast into fundamentalism and essentialism around this, So this has to do with Hindu conceptions of the world. This has to do with Chinese Taoist and Buddhist conceptions. This has to do with Islamic conceptions. So then there's a whole movement, say for instance, about Copernicus, that Copernicus was not the person, he didn't invent the heliocentric world. He borrowed it, or he stole it from Islam, from Islamic science. And why was Islamic science over here superior? It was because of the Quran and because of the encouragement that the Quran gave to empiricism. So it has to do then with something which is fundamental in a certain religious philosophical tradition. And this is what needs to be regenerated. And this becomes a problem in itself. How do you control this if you open the gates to civilizational history? But let's move on, which is what else happens at the same time? While this is happening, the problem is that all this is happening in reaction to something, and none of these movements ever talks to each other, you know? So the first thing is that you have science and empire, but that doesn't talk to the new histories of science, which are looking at the local. So they are not in conversation with any of these people. They are living in their own world, and they are fighting this idea of Western science. Basala, basically. In a way, they're also inspired by Needham, who says, yeah, you know, there are all these rivers which flow into the world, into the ocean of science, and so science belongs to everyone. But then you have to give value to each river, you know. So the Ganges gives you so much, and the Mekong gives you this, and the Yellow River gives you that, and the Euphrates and you know, gives you this other thing. So all these rivers are basically flowing into the sea, and this is the way in which the world is. And so you have to put new labels again on things. So it's, in a way, it's Needham against Basala. But it, you know, still it goes far away. It really starts from there, but then it moves into a very dangerous terrain of civilizational histories and religious histories. But while this is happening, another movement is growing in the West, which is not talking to this, which is also science and empire. And that is inspired by the fact that a lot of modern science, in fact, comes from European expansion. So green imperialism, colonial expansion, tropical island Edens, and the origins of environmentalism. So basically, environmentalism has to do with European expansion, seeing the rest of the world. I mean, it's a very, very interesting book in itself. But I'm not going to go into, I mean, I'm not giving you a detail of this. I'm talking more about the movements and what's going on in the world, while, you know, and how one is reacting to the other without talking to each other. So you have another one, which is Visions of Empire. It's voyages, botany, and representations of nature. So it's edited by David Philip Miller and Peter Hans Ryle. Cambridge University Press, 1996. So this is, you know, so it's more or less the same period. But only this time, what's happening in all these, another one, Cultures of Natural History, Nicholas Jardine, James Secord, and Emma Sparry. Again, 1996. These are rival publications, because also over here, it's not, it is the same group of people, but they're subgroups that don't talk to each other. So they're vying with each other to say, no, no, I have it better than you do. You know, my history is better than yours. And you know, all of them belong in a way to Cambridge. So these are two subgroups inside of Cambridge HPS. And there's a rivalry amongst them. Another one, Richard Drayton, Nature's Government, Science, Imperial Britain, and the Improvement of the World. Here again, the theme is science and empire. But this time, it is how modern science, in fact, owes a lot to empire for its development. Still, but the actors are still European in all this. There's no non-European. It's how empire opens the world to new questions. And because of empire itself, because of the logic of empire, science is the handmaiden of this logic. And this is, I mean, science is what provides the success for empire. But there are no non-Western actors in this. It's a story of how, in fact, empire opens up a new world, a new dimension. And of course, you have Daniel Hedrick, The Tools of Empire, Technology and European Imperialism in the 19th Century, and how science and technology enable empire. So this is, you know, on the one hand, the first series of books are about how imperialism opens the world to science, and the next are how science and technology enable. So it's the duality, it is this dialectical relationship between science and empire. And of course, the classic machines as the measure of men, science, technology, and ideologies of Western domination. Michael Adas. And in a way, both these books, Hedrick and Adas, are denouncing science, showing how science is the tool, you know, through which imperialism develops. So now let's come to, this is the world at the end of the 20th century, roughly. I mean, the intellectual world, this is the way in which our domain is configured. But while this is happening, something else is also happening, which is the rise of the post-colonial. And this brings me to the post-colonial movement and their reinvention of colonial knowledge, or their invention of colonial knowledge, which in fact has emphasized the generalities of power and culture over particular situated actions and practices, utterances, and aims. So they conceive of knowledge in this context as essentially it's a cultural project for them, colonial knowledge, which is a cultural project of control. So while we are talking about all this modern science and so on and so forth, what is happening is that by colonizing the world, or, you know, in colonizing the world, Western powers are also developing forms of knowledge to control and subjugate the world, the colonized world. And this is called colonial knowledge. Of course, at the same time as this is happening in post-colonial, you know, in the post-colonial world, there is also another form which we call colonial science, which is the sciences which are used, in fact, to control the space, the colonial space. So you have things like mapping, you have anthropology, you have the sciences of administration, you have botany, for instance. These are also called colonial sciences. But in the post-colonial movement, what they call colonial knowledge is knowledge which is made to control population. So anthropology is really the key to this. But by doing so, they do not unpack what they take to be colonial knowledge. In fact, it's a nebula of systematized activities that could be described as administrative practices of the state. And this is based, in fact, on their ideological and conceptual structure comes from Edward Said's classic book, which is called Orientalism, which was published in 1978. And his influence within the academy and further afield has been as extensive as it has been diverse. His key theoretical contribution is the demonstration of how the idea of the universal within European thought is based on a claim to universality at the same time as it elides its own particularity, and how this claim is sustained through the exercise of material power on the world. So it is universal because they're able to, in fact, impose this universality on the rest of the world. It's through their power that their knowledge is universal. That at the same time as they are developing their knowledge, they are also making the rest of the world inferior. And this is the idea of Orientalism, of making the rest of the world the other of Europe. So Europe is superior because the rest is inferior. Europe is, European knowledge is better because the rest is local, it is restricted. And so you see, it's in fact a vicious circle. It becomes that because of the power of Europe, because of the fact that it dominates the world, that it is able to impose its knowledge as being universal. And by creating a non-West, which is another, it's the other. Now, so this, in fact, immediately gives rise to a movement. So the key books in this are Colonialism and Its Forms of Knowledge by Bernard Cohn, who was an anthropologist specialized in India in the University of Chicago. And he wrote a lot about the rise of administrative knowledge in India in the 18th and 19th centuries. So, and so these post-colonial scholars, in fact, by taking up Edward Said, but also Michel Foucault and his idea of power and knowledge, they look at modern science then as a kind of it's a master narrative of Western power. And this Western power is agentless. There are no people in this, so it's not a history, the way in which we do history. It's not people, it's not agency that's involved. It is discourse analysis. It's all about Western discourse and how this Western discourse was superior to other forms. Problems?
No.
Okay. So it's a discursive formation through which the rest of the world was simultaneously subjugated and relegated to the role of Europe's binary other. It's opposed. So if Europe is rational, the rest of the world is irrational. If Europe is superior, the rest is inferior. It's a binary, but it is through an analysis of discourse. Right. And this was developed, this idea, by an Indian historian called Gyan Prakash, who is a professor of history at Princeton. And Gyan Prakash, in fact, wrote a book which is called Another Reason: Science and the Imagination of Modern India. And in this, so the spread of Western science, then in this view, is achieved by a means of violent imposition of rationality on other cultures who were originally endowed with another reason. So they had other ways of looking at things, and then the West comes and it's a kind of a hegemonic imposition of their rationality on the rest of the world. So, however, far from replicate, but according to him, what happens is that while they are trying to impose this, Indian subjects are not actually mimicking. I mean, they're not looking at the West and taking up this rationality. They are mimicking and deforming this in their own world. So this is science and the imagination of modern India, is that there is something like, which we can call mimicry and hybridity. So they are taking the science and hybridizing it and making it into something which is not quite Western science. It's hybrid between the two, and because of that, it doesn't work. So it's a mere travesty of Western metropolitan knowledge. So their political and ideological appeal notwithstanding, these critiques tell us nothing about the nature of the putative non-Western reason, because he says there's another reason. But what is this other reason? What is happening? They don't go into this. In fact, again, over here, this kind of history is theory-driven, and it analyzes discourse, not what is happening in a laboratory. It's all about what people say about science. And it's all about looking at this power-knowledge nexus and imagining that the pre-colonial past is innocent. Nothing bad was happening over here, everything was great, and we have to try and open this up. And this is what brings me to the decolonial. Now, while, if you notice in all this, and I didn't mention this, but you should have, it was quite clear to you, which is that all that's been happening from the 1970s onward, science and empire, the post-colonial, etc., have all had to do with both the imperial world of Northwestern Europe and had to do with Asia and North America and North Africa. So while post-colonial, the post-colonial movement never actually said, never named this, but the post-colonial was in fact a movement which emerged from Asia, especially from India, and had a lot to do, it was talking about the world of the colonial world of Britain, France, and the Netherlands. So while while they originated in South Asian literary critics and was firmly, sort of anchored in in discourse analysis. So Edward Said and Foucault, and so they were questioning the implied assumptions of the dominant discourses by which we make sense of the world. And thereby, they were denouncing the hegemony of European intellectual categories. The decolonial movement emerged 2 decades later. So the very end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. And it was anchored around the thought of a Peruvian sociologist, Aníbal Quijano, who died just about 5 years ago, and he was born in 1930. And the Argentinian semiotician, Walter Mignolo, born in 1941. Now, as its name suggests, it seeks to understand the close-knit relationship between the colonial condition and the imposition of a Western logic of modernity. So in a way, it's a consequence of colonialism. Hence, decoloniality is not so much a political project as an epistemological one. And also, so here you have Aníbal Quijano and Walter Mignolo. Now, as its name suggests, it argues for a decolonial epistemic shift that enables the histories and thought of other places to be understood as prior to European colonization in order to rethink the emancipatory ideals of modernity in the perspective of coloniality. So now, and these are the main texts, the coloniality of power, Eurocentrism and Latin America, and coloniality and modernity or rationality. So one is in 2000 and the other one is in 2007. Sorry, I didn't give the date for the first one, but it's 2000. And this one is 2007. And in the same issue of cultural studies, you have Walter Mignolo and delinking, he says, the rhetoric of modernity, the logic of coloniality, and the grammar of decoloniality. Now, in all this, as the name suggests, it argues for a decolonial epistemic shift that enables the histories of and thought of other places to be understood as prior to European colonization in order to rethink the emancipatory ideals of modernity in the perspective of coloniality. And this here I'm citing Walter Mignolo. So now, both these developments are in fact, you know, they have to do with European empires, but they have to do with, again, two different parts of Europe. This movement brings in something which post-colonialism didn't, which was, so this is a cry from Latin America. Hey, where are we? Where are we? You lost us, you know. We haven't been talked about at all so far. You know, you Asians and North Africans have been shouting about, you know, science and empire, then about post-colonialism, but where are we? You know, and so they take, in fact, the key issue over here is to emerge from the work of the decolonial scholars is to pull the time horizon of debates on modernity back to the late 15th century. That is to the start of Spanish and Iberian colonization. So two things have been ignored. Number one, in all this history of science, the Iberian Peninsula was ignored for Europe, because when we talk about Eurocentrism, it's not all of Europe. it is Northwestern Europe. So we try to bring back two things. Number one, the Iberian Peninsula, and number two, Latin America. So in fact, what it's doing is it's trying to bring back the Southern Europe, the Southern European countries, but also the southern half of the continent, which was to be named the Americas, in a way. Now, of course, this movement has also found an echo, a strong echo, in Africa. So here's an article from Nature 4 or 5 years ago, how decolonization could reshape South African science. And over here, so decolonization is a movement to eliminate or at least mitigate the disproportionate legacy of white European thought and culture in education. This is what, And according to the advocates of decolonization, this is not just about increasing the number of Black students. Although racial transformation is an important part of this process, it also means dismantling the hegemony of European values and making way for the local philosophy and traditions that colonists had set aside. And it's based, in fact, also on statistical analyses which show that, for instance, in Africa, 82% of African research is done in collaboration with Western sciences, 82%. 46 are produced by European countries, out of which 42 by France. So, I mean, it's enormous. And say, for instance, 14% by the US, 12% each by France and the UK. So now this problem over here is that if you do this, in all these cases, you're trying to decolonize. And when you, listen to Walter Mignolo, for instance, for one thing, the idea of the post-colonial is, and quite rightly so, because the post-colonial over here is the 19th century. I mean, you're all not post-colonial. You're miles away from the post-colonial. For us, the post-colonial is only 70 years away. Whereas, it doesn't make sense. But to talk about the decolonial and decoloniality is also a big problem. So what do you do? In other words, it's a kind of imagination of history and a historical imagination where you can put the clock back, and say, okay, let's go back to the 15th century. Because European modernity is based on colonization, and so we have to actually undo all this. It's like a psychoanalytical it's like a therapy, where you say, okay, let's do away with everything, and then I come back to myself. Is it possible to do that? And if you try to do that, what happens? What are the dangers? Because then the danger is indigenicism. In other words, you valorize everything which is indigenous. It's as if the indigenous was better than European science. The problem also is that modernity, everything in history is irreversible. You can't go back in time. It is, in fact, to see whether, questioning even the Western or the Occidentality of modern science. Is it totally Occidental? Is it something else that was going on? For instance, in my work, I've been striving to show how what is called, or major dimensions of what is called Western science, is in fact made outside of the West. It's the certification processes which might be Western. But in fact, its making is something quite different. And is it I mean, can we actually look at this without falling into the trap of fundamentalism? That is my question. All this is very well. You can keep on denouncing everything. But then it's also as if the past, before European colonization, everything was fine. Then what do you do with the Mexicas? And what do you do with the Inca over here? I mean, they were also brutal in a way. And were these, societies also not, in a way, trampling on local knowledge? Or were they not also exploiting local knowledge for themselves? And, you have to then begin to ask all these questions also. Is it enough just to say, okay, fine, the colonial is the problem? Western, so in other words, European colonization, because over here with the decolonial movement, it's as if you say, no, but we forgot the Iberians, they're also part of this world, you have to put them back into the picture. They're also evil people in this. But but what happens to the others? I mean, what happens to the pre-colonial period? Is it the pre-colonial period? Is it pristine? Is it something which where everything was fine, and had these horrible Europeans not come into the picture, everything, we'd have had a nice world? And also it has to do with the fact that European knowledge is not universal. It has been, what the past 40 years of the history of science has been telling us is that that scientists themselves have to fight to make this universal. It's not enough to sit on, piggyback on European superiority. It's not because of European superiority that anything becomes universal. It becomes universal because you have to engage in all kinds of strategies to make it universal. So is that not our problem today? Is it not the fact that, I mean, it's not so much as revalorizing the local in discourse as seeing what it takes to go beyond the local in order to make something universal. So these are the questions, and this is my problem. That's why I put a question mark. Decolonizing. I mean, I hope it was coherent, what I was trying to say. I mean, I hope my question comes out in a way, in an understandable way. And that's why I'd like to leave it as a question with all the dangers that are involved in this new phenomenon that we have, this intellectual phenomenon of trying to either post-colonialize or decolonialize something, instead of looking to see, and also the relativism that, the other problem is relativism. So everything is then as good as everything else. And, what I'm thinking has to coexist with what you're thinking. I don't know. I mean, in a world where we live today, is it possible to do that? At one level, yes. I mean, we have to respect each other. So this is not a kind of totalitarianism and one way of looking at the world, of course, but modern science itself is not coherent. I mean, people might say that this is universal or that is universal, but within what we call modern science, we have lots of contradictions. You have people thinking in contradictory ways, and yet what they're thinking is still, sort of accepted by a number of people at the same time. So there is a lot of, sort of dualities and more in modern science itself, and a lot of incoherences. So modern science is not necessarily a universal and coherent discourse. It's not a discourse to start off with. It's a series of practices which people have to fight to make universal. The universality is not given. So that's where I want to stop with posing this question to you all so that there's a discussion on this. No, I think, okay.
¿En español o en inglés? Lo que sea. Okay, in which sense do you mean fighting for universality? O sea, like in a sense of imposing, because in my point of view, universality, the same idea of universality is a kind of modern idea of knowledge, no? Like the possibility of a universal knowledge, for me, it's already a modern idea of science, no? So when you say fighting for universality, is like fighting for what? I didn't understand that. That is my question.
Yeah, okay. That's, in fact, I was taking for granted the fact that I have taught over here, and this question of the local and universal is something that we've discussed already. But let me come back to this. The point is that in the history of science, or in the way in which we understand science, science's universality, and you're perfectly right, is a modern concept. It has to do with modern science. And we think that what is right is universal. Okay? That's the way in which we all, that's the common sense perception of science. Science is universal because it's right. Okay? And so if you get, if you discover the right, the right phenomenon or the right explanation of things, like, gravity exists, and then Newton suddenly found an explanation for this gravity. And because he found this explanation, which is valid, it's universal. That's the way in which.
Like in the sense of truth.
Exactly. It's in the sense of truth. Exactly. In truth, you can't have truth which is not universal. Otherwise, it's not truth. Right?
But that this Newton in Einstein.
Yeah, okay, okay.
Like a
right.
reconstruction even from the universality.
Okay,
of Newton.
Okay. But still, to be simple, the first truth is a truth, and because it's truth, it has to be, you have to accept it. If you don't accept it, you're either, idiotic or mad. Okay,
but,
that's the way in which we.
Which is the universal.
Which is that is the meaning of universe. But then, in the last 50 years, historians and sociologists of science have been looking at what is the universal. And the more they look at it, the more they see that in fact, nothing is universal. Everything is local. So Newton, in fact, if he discovered the laws of motion, the three fundamental laws, it wasn't enough for him to discover these and to say, I've discovered it, and then people, eureka, everyone says, yeah, that's right. No, there's a huge investment after that to convince people that you're right. And that conviction needs a lot more than just showing something to someone. It means, first of all, that Newton has to establish his credibility. Who are you to say this? Huh? You just can't get up over here, you yourself or me, if I were to get up and say something. Why should anyone listen to me? It's not because, I mean, they won't say, yeah, this guy's telling the truth. No. I first and foremost have to establish my credentials. Okay? Partly that credential comes from this here, doctor, from an introduction from Professor Barahona, who is already a professor over here in this university. You know, she hasn't come from somewhere or the other. We haven't picked her up and put her over here to introduce me. So it's all this that builds on credibilities. Who do you cite? How do you? He is a member of the Royal Society. He's a professor in Cambridge, Newton. He's also the head of the Mint. So it's all these things. He's the power. He is the person who controls all the prisons in London and in the. So I mean, it's through that his power is imposed. Okay. And that's how we begin to see how the local becomes universal. It's a series of movements. It's not given. This is what I meant when I was saying this. I was just giving you one example. Of course, after that, someone else says no. And that's why one universal can be replaced by another universal.
Exactly, no, by a different structure of because as you are saying, Newton imposed, well, thought a través, like through imposed its knowledge through its position in the modern institution of science, no?
Exactly.
And that's why it became kind of accepted in the city in that science, no?
Yeah, but it's not just because it's Western. I mean, you know, against Newton, you had the French. The French did not accept Newton for 100 years.
Because it's a different structure of.
Yeah, exactly. And there were people who were contesting this. That's how you have all these expeditions of Jussieu and others who come to, to the Amazon. And they're trying to measure the Earth against the English. You also have Maupertuis, who they sent to the North Pole, or as far as possible to the North Pole, because they don't believe that this is the structure of the Earth and that Newton's principles actually work. So, I mean, this is Europe. It's not even as if these are people sitting in another part of the world. No, this is inside of Europe itself. So even within Europe, because we are looking at it from the outside and saying, okay, this is European knowledge, but Europeans don't think this is European knowledge at all. Even to become European knowledge, it takes a century. You see, I mean, that's what I'm saying. So it's not, so you can't say that this is, this is Western knowledge. It's not, I mean, even to become Western requires a lot of investment. Finally, it's after the 7 Years' War, after the fact that France is defeated, that they begin to think that there might be another way of looking at that. Maybe Newton is right. You see, I mean, so Europe is not, I mean, there's nothing like as if the world is composed of these structures which are taken to be taken for granted. It's not because Europe had superior knowledge that they were able to dominate the rest of the world. No. I mean, you have to begin to think like a historian. Not take these things for granted, but see how. What is happening? We do that in political history, in social history, in cultural history. There's no problem. But in the history of science, we think that science is superior because it's true. No. Its history itself shows that it's not that way. That's why the history of science is not taught as part of history in the faculty of history.
Okay.
Right, I mean,
like the struggle.
Yeah.
I don't know if. No sé si alguien.
I think Tere had a question, no?
Last week we have the opportunity to listen Helen Longino, the philosopher of science, and she talked about her new idea, her new ontological project, which is interaction as a category of research. So I've been thinking, can we translate that idea to history of science in terms of negotiations, study of controversies, as the nucleus,
Yeah.
of producing science, no matter the century, no matter the space. Bueno, sí.
Yeah. So, of course, I mean, you can, but you can't just look at controversies or negotiation. There are a lot of other things that are happening at the same time. And power is definitely there. It's not as if you can eliminate power. There are asymmetries involved. Okay? I mean, you know, like for instance, right now, there is an asymmetry between you and me. And that asymmetry comes from the fact that, as I said, I have an institutional position. And because of that, if there's someone else listening to us, what you are saying will have a priori less weight than me. Not necessarily, I mean, at the end of the day, you might say, yeah, she's right and he's wrong. But you won't dare to say that loudly. Why? Because there's an asymmetry. But still, that doesn't mean that you can't open your mouth and that you can't say no to me. Right? And that at the end of the day, like for instance, I mean, there is a question, even if I hadn't posed the question, and I had ended by saying that no, decoloniality and post-coloniality are wrong. Don't believe them, they're dangerous. Okay, I could have finished with that. And I mean, that's the way I would have finished normally. In, you know, in a different kind of situation, in a different kind of configuration. So the problem is that yes, negotiation is part of the thing, but you also have to put power in. You have to put power asymmetries into this picture at the same time. That's what I'm saying. It's part of the equation. It doesn't solve the problem. It's not that because there are power asymmetries that there's no negotiation possible, that there's no controversy. Yeah, controversies and negotiations are always there. But there's something else also involved, which is I talked about last year a little bit, which is Garfinkel's position. You know, I told you about Garfinkel a little bit, and the fact that we are always looking for consensus. Even if we don't agree, finally, society is not all the time in a kind of struggle to you know, this is not a Marxist agonistic problem, one against the other. No, it's a world where we also think that we should, you know, we should come to an agreement. And we have to see what are the processes of coming to an agreement. Finally, I have to give away a little bit to you because we can't be in a world where we are always and you know, in antagonism with each other. The world doesn't function that way. We have to come to an agreement, and that agreement means that I have to give a little bit, maybe you have to give more because of the asymmetries, but maybe not. I mean, there are times when these asymmetries also work the other way around. Like, for instance, one can always say that women are in an inferior position to men inside of today's society, and yet there are places where they still have the upper hand. Okay, I mean, so you have to, on the one hand, there's a structural imbalance. On the other hand, you have to look at the individual cases all the time. And that is the work of the historian and the social scientist. Not to take, so we are not, I mean, you know, the problem is structuralism. That once you think that there's a structure and that structure will explain everything. No, the structure does not explain anything. It is there. It's something which guides us. but it need not, I mean, it's not a necessary explanation of things. So, I mean, against Helen Longino, against Sandra Harding, against all these people, I have one thing to say, which is, I mean, it's a plea more than anything else, which is move away from theory-driven history to question-driven history. Or anything, I mean, not history necessarily, but even sociology. Start with questions rather than with theories which tend to push us into certain directions. Ask questions and see how we can find sources to answer our questions. Of course, theories are there. I mean, it doesn't mean that, you know, gravity exists. If you jump out of the window, I mean, if you're on the 4th floor, you'll die, okay? Or at least you'll be terribly injured, right? I mean, you know, there's no way of getting out of that. But the point is that you still ask a question as to, and many people do that. Okay, you know, I have to jump out of this window. How can I jump out in the best possible way so as not to hurt myself? There is a structure. There is something. I mean, there is a problem. You're not going to float in the air. You're going to fall. How best do you do it? And that is what, as a social scientist, you have to see what are the people, what strategies are people using in order to live, that's all. And also to push their ideas further. You have an agenda. You want to do something. I mean, and as scientists, whether you're social scientists, whether you're in the humanities or whether you're in the hard sciences, you have to push your ideas. People won't listen to you unless you do that. And what are the strategies that you're using to do that? And how far will these strategies work for them to be, you know? So what is universal again? I mean, you know, for instance, if you're a particle physicist, your universality is restricted to particle physicists, because, you know, people who live with the wave theory of matter will not believe you. So that's also not universal. Again, I mean, you know, universality works within clubs. Yeah, exactly. Of course, you can move beyond that, but again, you have huge investments to make to do that. And that is what the new history of science and science studies have taught us. Yeah.
Besides to rethink historically, how can we decolonize modern science from modern science structures? The debate is placed in a university that we could say it's not a universal structure, it's a modern science structure. I think that the problem is not only in the object or the epistemic question that we can make, but also in the place from we are making the debate. Even our identity, do we consider ourselves as Mexicans, as Westerns or not Westerns? No, that could be another question, because how come my concern is about how can we have another epistemic frame to think if we are learned to think a lot of times in structure, in modern Western structures that are built historically.
I'm trying to understand your question. So let me throw it back. I mean, just tell me if I've got it right. So what you're saying is that what you think, you right now. So you're asking, so your question basically is what you think Western, or is it?
No,
No.
no. Well, I am thinking to decolonize modern science,
Yeah.
we have to recognize not Western knowledge, but not only to recognize them, but also, as you said, to make a epistemic shift where we can understand that the ways in we are thinking are built in this relation between Western and not Western, and that happens in a historic moment, a specific historic moment.
No, I don't. I never said that. I didn't say that. I mean, there's no West. I mean, for me, there's no such thing as Western already. What is Western? It's not, I mean, the Spanish don't think the same way as the English don't think the same way as the Portuguese don't think the same way as, Okay, I mean, and people don't think in terms of, this is a very contemporary way of looking at things. Did the Portuguese think like Portuguese in the 16th century? I'm not sure. Because our idea of the nation state, because much of this comes from our present day ideas of what the West means, what nations mean, what national over here also, what is Mexican?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, all these questions are very contemporary questions. Can we push them back into the past? I don't think so. I think that, things happen, and even today, they don't happen nationally. It's not because someone in Britain or someone in France discovers something that everyone in France will think that that's right. It's not because it's French that it's right in France. Even over there, you require a lot of investment to make sure that, this thing is recognized beyond your little walls. And that where you stop is another question. It doesn't become universal either. It stops within certain regions. There are spaces within which things circulate, and outside those spaces, they don't circulate, even inside of the West. So the local and the global, sort of coexist side by side. And they're not necessarily local, they become regional. They can be accepted within a certain group of laboratories, and not outside of that. Like, for instance, just take the idea of Russian science, of Soviet science. Now, Soviet science, on the one hand, is science that, I mean, it works. They did send, a dog out into space before the US could. They sent people out into space. It wasn't as if it wasn't working. Yet it wasn't universal. So they based themselves on notions of physics, but the way in which they constructed their satellites and the way in which they constructed their rockets could not be imitated by others, and vice versa. The way in which the US constructed its rockets and sent its satellites into space worked differently from the Soviets. I mean, the basic principles, yes, okay. I mean, that's not a problem, but that's trivial. You can't do anything with basic principles. Everyone recognizes. I mean, that if you drop an object, you can go out into the Amazon, and if you ask some tribal who's never seen, any of us who's not in contact with the rest of the world, but if you were able to talk to them and say, listen, I mean, if you drop an object, do you think it'll float? No, it'll fall. They don't live in a different world that way, okay? It's just that they explain things slightly differently. They have a different way, and those micro differences is what makes the world of physics, for instance. I'm just talking about this. That's the way in which different countries also can, and different institutions conceive of things within. That's one of the reasons why you can't transfer something from one laboratory to another laboratory, even within a world where people speak more or less the same language. So that is what I'm saying. And to be able to transfer something from one place to another becomes problematic because of that. So in a way, you know, that last citation that I gave you where I said that 80% of research in Africa is done with foreign collaboration. That is a problem. Because of that, you know, they're stuck within molds that they can't get out of. Because if 80% of your research is done, that means that someone is controlling the way in which, if you know, all your protocols, all the values that you take. How do you measure something? What do you do first? What do you do next? So if you go to another a biology laboratory, say for instance in France, they will not be working the way in which you all are working over here. If you go to Brazil, they will not be working the same way as you all are working. So you need, you know, you need protocols, you need translations between different protocols for you to have equivalences. And this is where imperialism, yes, it works. If you have power over someone, then you're going to impose your protocols on others. Okay, this is a problem. But this does not mean, so the decolonization does not mean that you go back to your old forms of knowledge. It means that you get out of the power of one framework to be able to do, but the research that you're doing is then not research. I mean, you're not going to move away from the biology that you're doing, that you're practicing over here. It is that you're going to move away from the protocols that are imposed on you. Suppose you were to buy some equipment from the US or from anywhere else, from France. That equipment comes with a way in which you use it. You're forced to use it in a certain kind of way for it to give you results. If you don't follow the protocol, then you don't get the results. So you're a prisoner of those protocols, and that is a problem. So if you want to do something, then you have to break out of that machine and the instruction booklet that comes with it. You have to do something with it. You have to open it up. You have to open the black box and look inside it and then modify things and make your own protocols. And that is a problem. That's where, but that's not decolonization. That is the way in which the modern world works. In other words, everything is black boxed. You are forced to open the black box to be able to do anything at all. Which doesn't mean that you give up the idiom. Which doesn't mean that you do another kind of biology over here. No. I mean, your biology will be the same biology that you're doing everywhere else, but you'll be doing it differently in terms of the practices and in terms of the manipulation.
But if we change biology for history and do the same questions, it's not about, I don't know, any person in any place in the world should have to break the protocols of, I don't know, ISIS, I don't know, another mainstream journal for history.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we could take a debate, because the debates are placed in that places, in that journals, in that was my question. We have those structures that are outside of what we can do. No, I am making history. Yes, I am making history.
Yeah.
But I don't want that protocols. But if I don't follow that protocols, how can we discuss?
Well, the point is that those journals have changed. Don't forget that that ISIS has changed over 100 years, and that there's a pressure coming from people like you to publish different things. And today, if you read the instructions for authors, it's changed over the last 20 years in ISIS. It's a very good example. ISIS today says that they're going to encourage people who talk about the non-mainstream research. Till 20 years ago, it was mainstream, 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 and mainstream. If you did anything like what I did, they wouldn't entertain this. This was extreme thought. Today, they're looking for this because there's a market. Don't forget that, that there's also there's a demand for this, okay? There are more and more people who are working like us. And because of that, if they still want to stay in power, they have to accommodate us. It's not only because of people like us, it's also because of the university demography in the States and in Europe, where you have more and more people who come from the non-West. You have to, this is a market, okay? It's not an ideology, it's a market, okay? And the market changes and so this is, what I'm trying to say is that over here, it's not enough to say, okay, let's go back to our past. No, the point is we have to develop strategies. Yeah. This is the thing, in order to be able to, but the point again is that you're still publishing in ISIS. Yeah. Because that's the way in which you can address the largest number of people. I just wrote a paper and it took me, I think, 2 months just to debate as to where I was going to publish it. Was I going to publish it in a history of science journal, a history of medicine journal, a history journal? Perhaps, because what we are doing again is borderline. It's between history and history of science. And why shouldn't we be addressing a wider public to put pressure on the history of science? Why shouldn't we marginalize the history of science then against something else? These are questions. And this means that this is not a question of decolonizing, it's not going back to a past. It is living in this world and seeing how we can do something in this world to change what we think are, immutable structures. This is the way, because the problem then is to look at our categories themselves. And this whole idea of the colonial as a category, does it make sense? Yes, it does in a certain kind of way, if you want to do certain things. But you can't say, let's decolonize, let's post-colonize, okay, we're post-colonial anyway.
Yeah.
Whether we like it or not.
Yeah, that's my question. What we can do?
What we have to do is then not go, certainly not to militate and, sort of say, we have to go back to the past, we have to do this, no. The point is we live where we live. I don't want to live in the past. Certainly not. I don't think the past was a better world than this one. And I think the world in which I live is the only world I know. Okay? And the past is also something that is taught to us, it's romanticized. Mignolo and what was his name? Quijano were certainly not people who knew anything about or know anything about the local. They live in universities. They've never done historical research. Mignolo especially, he's a semiotician. He only works with words. So, you can construct whatever you like. I want to see, I want to live in this world and see how we can do something to break out of monopolies, okay? That's the problem. There is a mainstream. There's a mainstream of all kinds everywhere. Even over here, in your own country, in your own institution, there's a mainstream. The question then is, how do you impose something else in that mainstream. And history teaches us lessons there. And that's why I like science studies in a way, because, okay, I mean, I have lots to say against them, as I said over here. You know, I mean, they think that if you go back to the past, then it's just Europeans who did everything. But they also contribute a lot to the way, they have contributed a lot to see how science functions. It's everyday functioning. And there are lessons to be learned from that, which we can apply elsewhere. So it's not by compartmentalizing the way in which all this has been done, because all this is compartmentalizing. Even they themselves, I mean, science studies themselves are compartmentalized, and they compartmentalize themselves. They don't want to talk to science and empire. Science and empire doesn't want to talk to post-colonial studies. Post-colonial studies doesn't want to talk to decoloniality. Everyone is doing their own little thing in their own little spaces. So if you want to make, I mean, if you want to have something, then you have to look and see what are the contributions and what are the questions? I accept the questions, the decolonial people's questions. There is a problem. I mean, there is a problem over here when we talk about, how decolonization could reshape South African research. What's going on in South Africa? There is a question over here, but is this the answer? No, I mean, there are other ways. People can suggest things from outside, and we can look to see what's going on and how does this change our picture. So, I mean, I go much more for dialogue, with others. But dialogue doesn't mean agreement. It means precisely. So it's not just a question of negotiation. It's also a question of seeing, being open, and not being, and certainly not going in with an ideology of any sort. You have to know that you're living in this world, that you don't have immense power, that you have your limited power, and it's with that limited power that you have to do something. And that's why after a while, all these people give me a headache, because, they talk so much about theory. I mean, ask questions, look at a text and see what happens. So,
writing.
uh-huh.
But meanwhile, she ends typing. I maybe just want to, but like the talk we are having here makes me think that the colonizing or the coloniality is something that takes space in a lot of, I actually wrote it, in a lot of discussions. Even in feminism, we're talking about the importance of reappropriating our reference of life. So, and actually we can also say that decolonizing our frameworks of life has the potency to dramatically change the reality. But the thing is, and we also can say that in that sense, that the coloniality is urgent, because we can say, we can see examples of colonization every day. I mean, not just in science, but we can also see on Palestine, a lot of political things.
Yeah.
So, but how can we start? I mean, how can we, as you were saying, how can we start on our own actions? Because another thing is that coloniality is not is a framework, but is not an identity. So, as it's not an identity, we can say that is a lot of actions and a lot of is our own framework, right? So I was thinking that maybe it's not a question, it's more than a comment, that maybe we can as the coloniality is present in a lot of discussions, maybe we can start seeing other examples, not just in science, but like, I don't know, maybe in the Kurdas or something.
Yeah.
I was thinking on that.
Yeah, okay. I mean, but the thing about, I mean, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Colonialism, I mean, exists, has existed. It still exists today. I mean, your example of, of Palestine is a very, I mean, it's there, present in our minds all the time today, So I mean, it's a form of colonialism. It's not the only way of this is settler colonialism. It's the way in which things have happened, and there are other examples of this in history. But not all colonialism is like this either, I mean, colonialism in Mexico was not like this at all, but it was in North America, in a way. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there are different, and I don't want to throw this baby out with the bathwater. On the other hand, my problem is, can we use colonialism today as a kind of a buffer against which we have to construct everything? Listen, I mean, for you all, it's 2 centuries since, I mean, almost, colonialism in a classic way. After that, there are other forms of colonialism. There are neocolonialism, there's neocolonialism of all kinds also. And then again, this colonialism is not just the colonialism of, which comes from the US. Of course, it's strongest over here because it's just next door to you. But you have other forms of colonialism, which come in, and you have colonialism values which comes in from China. I mean, that's also a form of colonialism, which we don't look at. And that's not Western. That's yet another form. So, I mean, the problem is, what do we mean by this, unpack these terms of colonial and non-colonial, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is, there are influences. There are all kinds of influences, and everyone is trying to be hegemonic. If Indians are investing over here in steel, if they're investing heavily in transport in this country, they're also trying to capture a bit of the market. They're also trying to influence something or the other in this world. And then there's, I mean, Mexico itself is also trying to influence others. And Mexico is not just a victim. See, I mean, so in this, that's what I'm saying. So that the problem is that these kinds of binaries, where you have the colonial and the colonizer, the colonized, and so on. The problem with this is that on the one hand, it's helpful to think, but to a point. It's a macro world in which you can think this way, but it's not a world. These categories do not help us go further than make sense at a very, very broad level of how the world works. Of course, I mean, but I would immediately say that there's an exception right today, which is Palestine, where, of course, this category, I mean, we have to have to use this. I'm talking about it much more at a general level. I'm not saying that, you throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's no colonization, there's no colonialism, there's no post-colonial, there's no decolonial. No, 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 no. What I'm saying is that these categories in this particular case are not good.
A YouTube question is Ame Gallardo. It's a long one. So she says, so universal threat of science has to do with the fact of ways life works out. For example, here in China, gravity is the same, or here and in India, genetic code is the same for organisms. Or for example, in ecology, it has been a need for for a holistical approach, looking at the big picture, starting from a hierarchical organization. It has been described and analyzed how effects of environmental stresses are expressed in different ways and different levels of biological organization. This sounds to me like this thing of local component of reality, but is not by itself, but in relation with the universal, but is in relation with universal. This hierarchy theory suggests that higher levels of organization incorporate and constrain the behavior of lower levels. So I think this is a decolonial approach, and that's all.
Yeah, okay. I don't know how to analyze this. Yeah. No, I mean, again, to come back to what I was saying is that we require freedom to think. Okay. So if we are fighting against some sort of hegemony, where you're forced to think in a certain kind of way, no, no, absolutely not. But then again, I mean, we think within frameworks, within grammars. And the point is not to let everyone think the way they think, but to make sure that there is negotiation and dialogue, and to keep that space open. But again, that space can't be opened by your saying, no, I don't believe, okay, if you're sitting in a biology laboratory and you say that you don't believe in anything that goes on over there, if you don't share any of the language of that laboratory, then go elsewhere. You're not going to sit there and say, how do I know that this happens? I mean, maybe human beings are born, I mean, there's no such thing as genetics, there's something else going on. Yeah, okay, maybe you think that way, but then it's the onus is up to you to make sure that you can construct a dialogue with others to impose this, and not say that, okay, I can think this way, okay, you think that way, then go and sit in your own place and think however you like. But I mean, that means that there's total relativism in the world. You are right, and I'm right, and she's right, and you're right, and everyone else over here is right. And we all have the right to sit and think however we like. Okay. I mean, that's also an extreme form of individualism and total relativism. I mean, in which case there's no dialogue possible. So if you want, I mean, but dialogue always means that you're trying to impose your position on others. Okay. I mean, it's always that. I mean, but you say, no, I mean, I object to what you're saying right now. You don't say, no, I don't believe this, so I'm okay, I'm fine. So I say, okay, fine. If you're fine, then why do you come here? We found another. Exactly. But that's the way, I mean, that is the way in which science actually does work in a laboratory. I mean, of course, there's one way in which it works is that, okay, someone imposes something, then everyone else is a technician and they follow what someone imposes. Okay, that's one way, but that doesn't happen everywhere and all the time. What happens most of the time is that different people are saying, no, it doesn't, perhaps, you're finding problems. And then you're working out things and saying, okay, then we come to an agreement somewhere, and this is it. And that agreement is perhaps not the truth. It's the best possible solution that you find at that time. And that's why that also explains what Newton is doing. I mean, fine, he thinks it's truth and everyone thinks that it's immutable. But it's more, I mean, there's more to it than that, because, 2 centuries later, someone else comes and says, this is rubbish. There's something else going on over here. But then again, Einstein had to impose himself. He didn't, he wasn't, it wasn't because Einstein came and opened his mouth and, he stood up and said something that everyone said, yeah, you're right. No. Yeah.
Bueno, ya no hay más preguntas. Rapidísimo, un minuto. Ahorita que
Yeah.
Nuria. Bueno, pues les damos las gracias por su presencia, los que estuvieron aquí de manera virtual, digo presencial, y los que estuvieron de manera virtual en nuestro canal de YouTube. El seminario se congratula de tener la presencia del doctor profesor Kapil Raj. Kapil, many thanks for your conference.
For suffering me.
No. It was great. Thank you very much, and you are very welcome whenever you want to be with us. Muchísimas gracias.